Hey, it's Valerie here, author of Life is What You Bake It, and I'm so glad that you are tuning into this tutorial, which is all about piping bags and how to have proper piping technique when you are piping various things, such as the macarons on page 91 of this book. So if you never actually used a piping bag or piped macarons before, we're gonna go over how to fill the bag and all that kind of stuff. So the first thing that you need is an actual piping bag. So this is an example of a disposable piping bag. They also have reusable piping bags, and I've actually had this one for years, and it is such excellent quality. But you know, if you don't necessarily feel like having to clean one out each time you use it, disposable ones work great. The next thing that you need is the right piping tip. So there are so many different piping tips that you can choose from. And for macarons, I like to use one of these. It's a Wilton 10 or 12 point tip. And all that means is like the type and the size of the opening. And I really like this size. I've actually used this Wilton 2A before when I've made macarons, but if you're making something like a really nice design with buttercream and you want to make those cute buttercream flowers, this guy, I like this. It's the Wilton 1M tip, which is great for piping buttercream flowers. But if you're going to do something like you're decorating cookies with royal icing, you're going to want a really fine point tip so that all of the royal icing doesn't gush out of the piping bag. So this is a Wilton, this is a 2. So this is really small. So to actually get your piping tip in your piping bag, we're just gonna snip off the bottom of the piping bag. And if you're doing a makeshift piping bag with like a Ziploc bag or something, that's fine too. And if I am decorating cookies with royal icing especially, and I want to, or a cake with buttercream, and I want to switch between different piping tips that are of the same size, you can actually use one of these things. It's called a coupler. And when you add the coupler, instead of putting the piping tip in the bag, you put this part of the coupler. And then that way you're actually just putting that piping tip, you're putting that piping tip onto the coupler so that you can take that piping tip off and then switch the piping tips out. But we don't have to worry about that today. So I'm gonna prepare my piping bag. So I'm just gonna open up my piping bag. I'm gonna slip my piping tip in to kind of see where it falls. And one of the great things about the reusable bags is you don't have to do this extra little step of snipping the bag. And I can see exactly where the piping tip is, so I'm just gonna cut right above where the piping tip is. And if you cut too much, the piping tip is actually gonna probably just slide right through the bag, which isn't the end of the world, but you will need a new piping bag. So I've got my piping tip right in the bag, and then to fill the bag, I like to kind of sit it, if you have a tall glass works best. You just kind of fold it over and fit it in the glass. I don't have a tall glass, but I have this tumbler, so that's what I'm gonna use. And this is just gonna make it easier to fill the bag. So I've got this really lovely macaron batter that I'm going to put into my piping bag. So what I'm gonna do is actually just kind of hold this in one hand or set it down. And I'm just gonna kind of put this into the piping bag. And the thing about piping bags, you don't wanna add too much batter or too much buttercream or icing into your bag, because the more that you have in the bag, the harder it is for you to control it as you're piping.
You can also pick up the bowl and pour it directly into the piping bag.
This looks good. And I'll just set the rest of this aside. And now what I'm gonna do, I'm just gonna kind of pick my bag up out of my container. And I wanna make sure my piping tip stays at the bottom and doesn't float up into the batter. And I'm just gonna use my hands to kind of push it down to get out the air. And then I'm gonna twist the top so that it doesn't spill out of the top. So I have this silicone baking sheet that has macarons etched onto it, and I have that on a baking sheet. So I'm gonna pipe right onto the silicone baking sheet. But if you don't have one of these, what you can do is you can actually stencil out the little outlines of your macarons, little circles, and then put a piece of parchment paper on top so that you can see it. But once you make these several times, you're gonna get to the point where you can just eyeball it and you don't need any help from any stencils or anything like that. So I'm gonna pipe these right directly onto this. I'm just gonna kind of hold my bag and put it and just apply pressure until I get the size of the macaron that I want. And then I just kind of make a little swoop motion. Just gonna apply pressure until I get the size that I want. And then make a little swoop motion. So I'm gonna apply pressure.
Continue until you have no batter left.
And if there are any tiny little points at the top of your macarons, you can just lightly, really lightly dip your finger in water and just kind of press them down like I'm demonstrating in the picture on page 94. All right, and the last thing, when you get ready to refill your piping bag. So when you refill your piping bag, it has this very sticky amount of stuff in it. And that's where a bench scraper or anything that has this kind of straight edge comes into handy. So I like to kind of spread out the bag and then just take my bench scraper and just scrape so all of that goes down in the bottom and there's less in the top, which just makes it easier to refill it. So thank you for watching about how to use piping bags and how to pipe macarons. And you know what? These are pretty much done. All I need to do is really drop them a few times to knock out the air bubbles. And then I'm gonna let those rest because I want them to kind of develop a skin on the top so that if I touch them, they're not sticky at all. So thanks for watching and make sure you check out the other tutorial videos that I have here.